intended. There are two terrorist forces. There's the state security forces, which are major terrorist forces, and there is Shining Path, which is another terrorist force. Now, if you try to add up, to measure the scale of these terrorist forces, the evidence indicates that the state terrorists are considerably more efficient. And that comes out even in, you take a look at, say, the reports of Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. I think that that's fairly clear. On the other hand, to say that the Shining Path is working for the benefit of workers and peasants, in my opinion, is a very serious distortion of the facts. Some of the people may be, but as groups, they're violent terrorist forces which are intimidating and undermining many attempts at popular organization. That's not to justify the terrorist forces of the state, but to give what at least I think is an accurate description of the situation. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you if you've done any studies on the National Endowment for Democracy. I called them the other day just out of curiosity, and the woman in their Middle East section got very surprised. She said, well, how did you hear about us? Nobody knows about it. Even Americans don't know about us. So I think that...
I haven't personally done any, but there are studies going on about it. There's the Resource Center in, I wish I had the address, but it's Albuquerque, New Mexico, right? Yeah, they have a project called the National Endowment for Democracy Project, which has done some good stuff. Anybody remember an address offhand? Yeah. I guess you guys probably have their address. Corporate Action people, don't you? Pardon? Council on Hemispheric Affairs, do they have a project on the NED also? Yeah. With the Resource Center. I see. So there's a joint publication of the Council on Hemispheric Affairs in Washington and the Resource Center in Albuquerque. Albuquerque, right? Yeah. William Robinson's book is on a special case, namely on the NED and other involvement in the Nicaraguan election, yeah. But these projects are about the whole affair. And it's, it's about what you'd expect from a bipartisan democracy campaign. It's attempting to impose what is called democracy, meaning rule by the rich and the powerful without interference by the mob, but within the framework of formal electoral procedures. And so this is not particularly my opinion. This is an opinion which you can find from, for example, a source that I'd suggest you look at is the leading Reaganite official who worked on democracy enhancement projects in Latin America and happens to be a very honest man. Thomas Carruthers has had a book and several articles on Reagan's efforts the Reaganite efforts to bring about democracy in Latin America, which he takes very seriously and says they were all very sincere. But he also describes what happened, and what he describes is that there was a negative correlation between U.S. influence and democracy. The less the U.S. had influence, the more there were steps towards democracy. So where U.S. influence was the least, like in the southern cone of the continent, there were the most steps for democracy. The U.S. also opposed them, strongly opposed them, and tried to impede them, but then later took credit for them when they became irreversible, very much what happened in the Philippines and Haiti, incidentally, and in when Marcos and Duvalier were overthrown. Where the U.S. influence was greatest, Central America and the Caribbean, he calls it progress to democracy was least. In fact, the destruction of democracy was greatest, is the more accurate way of putting it. And he then goes on to point out that what the U.S. sought, the ultimate objective of the United States, was top-down forms of democracy that left existing power structures with which the U.S. had been allied in place. That's democracy. And that's right, and that applies at home too. And that's what the NED is about, and the kind of stuff I was talking about is just an illustration of it. Again, let me stress that the passion evoked by the attempt of working people to influence their legislators is very revealing. That illustrates the passionate hatred for democracy on the part of educated elites, which is nothing new. It runs all through the literature and occasionally shows up in dramatic forms like this. And the NED has that conception of democracy, not surprisingly.
Please repeat the question.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Professor, what do you have to say about the recent enemy of the month, North Korea? Hardly a day passes when you see something on ABC, CBS, and NBC, not C-SPAN, by the way, but all the rest of the stations about how the North Koreans are about to invade the world or something like of that nature. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. So the question was, what about the current enemy of the month, was that's the way you put it, North Korea, which you hear about how they're going to conquer the world every day. Well, there's problems in the Korean Peninsula. I mean, North Korea is isolated and rather desperate and probably trying to figure out some way to get, to enter into the international community. I think they're doing it in a pretty crude way, using the threat of proliferation as a way to try to get some responses and benefits. They feel very threatened, and rightly so. And I think there could be a constructive reaction to this. But why is the U.S. Reacting the way it is? Well, one thing we can wipe out pretty quickly, and that is the belief that the U.S. is reacting to North Korean proliferation because the possible proliferation, because the Clinton administration is opposed to nuclear and missile proliferation. We can reject that hypothesis very quickly by simply looking at what I described. Remember that one of the great achievements, maybe the great achievement of the Asia-Pacific Summit was the U.S. agreement to violate congressional legislation and send high-technology equipment to China, which is directly involved in certainly missile and probably nuclear weapons proliferation. Well, that shows how much concerned they are with nuclear weapons and missile proliferation, and many other things show the same thing. So whatever reason it is, it's not that. And I think the reasons are probably the usual ones, rallying people around an enemy, concern over how to extend U.S. power in the Northeast Pacific area, and so on. It's not that, I don't want to say that the problem of nuclear possible proliferation in North Korea is a trivial problem. It's not a trivial problem, and it's probably real, I would guess. But there certainly are a lot more constructive ways to deal with it than these, and the arguments that are offered can't be considered seriously for a moment, if only for the reason I mentioned. Yeah?
Based on your studies and observations, what part of the plan by the rich in this country would the dissolution of the black family and crime, black-on-black crime in the inner cities of America, what part, would that be a part of your thesis relative to the non-profitability of people?
Yeah. So the question is, how does the dissolution of the black family and black internal crime in the black community and, the social breakdown there, how does that fit into this whole picture? Well, pretty straightforwardly, actually. I mean, the way the country's developed over the centuries, there were waves of immigrants who came in, and they were usually very much persecuted. And as the economy was growing, either because we were conquering the territory or one thing or another, they were kind of over time absorbed into the society. So like, say, my father worked in a sweatshop when he came from Russia, and his son went to college. Okay, that's, the kind of thing that could happen. The last great immigration into the United States, there were two recent major immigrations. One was the black immigration. Now, it's not usually called an immigration because it was internal, but mechanization of farming in the South forced a huge black population to the north, and it's equivalent to an immigration. It's as if they'd come from Alaska, as far as the system was concerned. There was a brief period when it could be absorbed, namely during the Second World War, when there were jobs. After that, there's been a period of stagnation of productive work, and in fact actually decline recently. So it's actually declining, and that simply means that population can't be absorbed. The Latino immigration is another one. It's an immigration in a period when there is not the kind of growth taking place that could absorb highly repressed and exploited immigrants. like, people from Eastern Europe, say, or South Italy at one point, or Ireland at one point. So what you're left, and in fact, these two immigrations, if you like, have coincided with a period of attack on workers' rights, on production, on welfare, of polarization of the kind I was discussing. So you have this huge population, which happens to be heavily, though not only, of course, black and Latino. And what do you do with them? Well, same thing you do with them in the third world. Either you lock them up in jail, or you lock them up in concentration camps called inner cities, in which you hope that they will prey on one another, and you put guards around to make sure that they don't get out, and various ways of doing this. Since there happens to be a race-class correlation, it makes it easier because you can, to a significant extent, identify the superfluous classes by skin color or something like that. But if they were white, it would come out about the same, in my opinion. That just makes it easier. It doesn't change the situation. And that's why you have things like the social engineering projects, like the crime bill, and others, which are a reaction to the fact that there is a population which is essentially useless for for profit making by the wealthy, and therefore they have to be controlled and marginalized. And if they just attack one another, that's perfect. Then, on the other hand, if they start attacking somebody else, that's not so good. So if crime in the inner city is just violence directed against women and black people killing each other, other poor people slaughtering each other, or whatever, okay, then it gets sort of back pages of the papers. If it breaks out into the white sectors, that's a different story, or the rich sectors. And there's all kind of ways in which this is done. I mean, you don't even need laws. Say where I live. I live in a suburb of Boston, middle-class suburb of Boston, professional people and that kind of stuff. It's almost, it's not actually lily white, but it's really close. If a black teenager drives into town in a car, it'll be 30 seconds before the police pick him up. Now there's no law about that, but it just happens. When there was a discussion about extending there's a subway system in Boston, and a couple of years ago there was some talk about extending it from the city where it works out to the suburbs. So it went as far as Harvard Square, and they wanted to move it a little bit further. There are two towns right down the way. One of them's Arlington, one's Lexington. I live in Lexington. Arlington is kind of lower middle class, white working class, and so on. Lexington, that's where I live, is kind of like professional and that sort of thing. Both towns, Arlington and Lexington, were strongly opposed to extending the subway line, which would be extremely convenient, I should say. Save a tremendous amount of time and money and everything else. They were both opposed. Arlington, the mostly white, ethnic working class and lower middle class town, were very straight about it. They said why they were opposed. They didn't want those black kids from Dorchester getting on for a quarter or whatever it was and walking around the streets of Arlington. In Lexington, you're more sophisticated, so people, and everybody's a liberal, vote for McGovern and that sort of thing. So that's not the reason that was given. There were much more complex reasons given with, multisyllable words and so on. But essentially, that's what it came down to. And these are techniques for keeping, the wrong people isolated where they belong. In some places, it's becoming quite extreme. Chicago, I don't know if they've implemented this. Maybe some of you know, but there was a plan in Chicago announced by the mayor's office about a year ago, I think, to break the city into regions, neighborhoods, and to limit access between the neighborhoods, and to have those limited accesses controlled, meaning people are just going to be kept to their own neighborhoods. Now, my feeling, I don't know if that was implemented or not, but things like that are happening and are going to continue happening. And what's more, they're going to have popular support, because as the people are afraid of crime, and they're right to be afraid of it, it's frightening. And if the causes of it are not going to be addressed, the causes in social disintegration